I'm Kate Cooper, and I'm Professor of History in the University of London and Fellow at the Hamburger Center for Apocalyptic Studies here in Heidelberg. My research for the Center for Apocalyptic Studies is about how ideas of the apocalypse change our understanding of gender and gender relations. And some of you will be aware that the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the revelation of the end of the world in very misogynistic terms, with this evil figure of the whore of Babylon being rolled on to represent everything that's corrupt in the world. And there are lots of interesting things to say about how Christian traditions go back all the way to the story of Adam and Eve and have this idea of women as the weaker force in society who can sometimes represent some of the weaknesses of humanity. But one of the things that is incredibly interesting about my own research is what I'm discovering is that the idea of the apocalypse actually doesn't lead to negative attitudes to women or gender imbalances, because some of the apocalyptic stories from the early Christian period that I study actually look at the courage of women facing this idea of the end of time or God's judgment. And fundamentally, for the early Christians, the idea of the apocalypse is an idea that's very ethical. It's about how you just have to stop and start focusing on what really matters. And in a strange way, it's not nearly as negative an idea as some of the cultural representations that we are used to maybe make it seem. In fact, in early Christian narratives, the idea that the world is going to end means that we have to change our lives to make them more ethical. And this idea of apocalyptic ethics is actually very valuable. Sometimes it leads to things that we in the modern world find confusing or strange. You have stories of people offering themselves for death as martyrs. You have people deciding not to marry and have children, and instead either to live in a monastery or to go out into the desert and live as a hermit in the wild. So it's in many ways, these ideas of an apocalyptic life are often intentionally shocking to the reader or to the person listening to the story being told, or to listening to a preaching about a particular Christian saint. But the idea that the saint is a person who should shock us and provoke us is actually a really positive idea in early Christianity. So one of the things that has fascinated me in my research is looking at the figures of early Christian saints and the characteristics that mark them as people who see that the world is going to end and we all have to get ready to be seen by God and essentially to be evaluated as whether or not we really have lived the life of righteousness. So one of the things that really surprised me about these early Christian narratives was the way that young women are often encouraged to disobey their parents. The idea is that the parents are trying to maintain the status quo while the children have an idealism that really is something that ought to be cherished. And I think this idea of cherishing the idealism of our young people is something that we can all stop to think about and admire. But it's really fascinating if you think about Christian writers in the early Christian period, so 1500 or 1800 years ago. These writers are talking about female defiance as something that God wants. He sends these girls in the world to remind their parents to stop and think differently. So that's not at all really what you expect. And similarly, some of the ideas about the young women or older women, widows are another category of figures who really figure in this strand of early Christian literature. Widows are people who've been married, they've had their children, their husband is gone, and now in a way they're left vulnerable because they don't have the protection of the structure of marriage, which in the ancient world was considered really important. So because of this, they're more closely connected to the Christian community, and they develop a kind of heroic figure of people who don't have anywhere to turn except following God and standing for the values of the community. So in the sense, the widows become heroes or heroines of faith, really as a way of taking their difficult situation and turning it into something that, God has kind of created this marvelous silver lining to the cloud. So that's something, again, that you wouldn't really expect. So people sometimes ask me, why should we care about what happened in the early Christian period thousands of years ago? And I have two answers for that. One is that the texts that were written in this period, particularly the New Testament, and also some of the stories of the saints that were handed down in the churches across the history of the church, those are narratives that are still with us, and they're still influencing how we understand the world. Even if we don't realize it, we might be experiencing those narratives in a secondary way through how they influenced 19th century writers, or how they influenced our grandparents, or how they influenced our own family. So in that sense, those texts are still living texts in many cases. The other thing that's really fascinating about it is I find, talking to students again and again, I find that it's really useful to understand that the past is not a monolithic world in which people knew their place and knew what was going to happen. It's a world in which people were struggling and arguing just the way we are doing today. And in that sense, to see how one period that has influenced us really turns out to have been much more human. The early Christian writers and the early members of the early Christian communities were experimenting and arguing and exploring in a way that really is surprising, in that they didn't always do what we might think they would have done in dealing with the challenges that they faced. But they often also have something really interesting and surprising to tell us as we think about our own challenges.